And we're going live on Facebook.
Woohoo.
All right. Well, I'm just going to put this little X at the top. Perfect. Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Just so you're all aware, as I just mentioned, this is being recorded. We'll be posting it to our YouTube channel later on, and it's also being live streamed right now to Facebook Live, Brampton Library's Facebook page. If I can just ask everybody to stay muted during the presentation. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat window. So if you're not familiar with WebEx, it's on the bottom right-hand side. You'll see a little chat. And then also, if you would like to use closed captions, they are on the lower left-hand side. So you'll see a little CC, and you can click on that, and that will open up closed captions for you. That's for those of us who are joining us on WebEx. I think that's everything. Does anyone have any questions about using WebEx? And if you want to, use your camera or not use your camera, there's also a little camera icon at the bottom as well. Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Brampton Library is located on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and before them, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Huron, and Wendat. We also acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and other global Indigenous people that now call Brampton their home. We are honored to live, work, and enjoy this land. So, my name is Megan Gilpin, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm a diversity and adult services librarian with the Brampton Library, and I'm joined by Maureen Kaus, who is an exhibition coordinator with the Peel Art Gallery Museum and Archives. Thank you all very much for joining us today. So, why do we recognize Black History Month? I've often heard the question asked, shouldn't we recognize Black history all year round? And I think the simple answer to that is an obvious yes. Of course we should, but a more layered answer is that we generally fail to do that. We know that our history books have historically been and often still are told from the perspective of the white settler. And if we don't look beyond that perspective for diverse voices that tell a different story, we give more power to the privileged. And this can and does have consequences for those who are marginalized. And so we take this month as one way to make a conscious effort to not allow Black history to continuously be swept under the rug. Though granted, this is not enough. As an ally, I recognize that this is just a part of the work that we need to do as a country and as a community, because all lives cannot matter until Black lives matter too. And so I welcome you here today, and I thank PAMA for joining me here as well to amplify some Black Canadian voices so that we may begin to continue our work through listening. And I urge you to continue listening and learning and unlearning long after we end this event today. So let's jump right into it. I'm very excited to welcome Maureen Kaus, who, as I mentioned, is an exhibition coordinator with the Peel Art Gallery Museum and Archives to walk us through their current exhibit, Our Voices, Our Journeys, Black Communities in Peel. If you have any questions for Maureen while she's giving her presentation, please, as I mentioned, leave them in the chat box on WebEx, or if you're watching us on Facebook Live, please leave a comment in the chat. And once Maureen concludes the presentation, please stick around because I'm really excited to share some great complimentary books written by Black Canadian authors and historians. I know we're slotted until 2:30 today. I think we might go a little bit beyond that, so I hope that you can join us, especially depending on how many questions you have for Maureen. But I'm totally fine with that, and I hope that you are too. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that Maureen can share hers.
Sure.
All right, let's see here.
Oop. Share, share, share.
There you go.
There we go. Thank you, Megan, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Thank you for the invitation. A little context, if you don't know, PAMA excuse me, right off the top, I'm choked up. PAMA is the Peel Art Gallery, Museum and Archives, and we are just around the corner from the Four Corners branch on Wellington Street in the old jail and courthouse. And as the name implies, we have an art gallery, we have a museum, and we have an archive. So if you're interested in any of those topics, we are the place to come. Unfortunately, along with everything else, we are closed at the moment, but one of the sort of silver lining, I suppose, of the pandemic is we are now presenting a lot more online. And that's exactly what happened with this exhibit, Our Voices, Our Journeys. We installed the exhibit in PAMA last February 2020, and we were able to celebrate a little bit, and we had a great family day. And then, of course, everything shut down in March. So this year, we're re-presenting it, reintroducing it to our community through an online version. So this is a great way to tell community stories, and like I said, with doing everything online, we can broaden our audience a little bit and spread those stories a little wider. So it is a bit of a silver lining in that people may not be able to visit PAMA for whatever reason, whether we're open or not, but this way we can get that story out, and literally people around the world can read this and understand this. Trying to tell the story of the Black communities in Peel is sort of an insurmountable task. It's a huge story, and unfortunately, a lot of information is not available. It's one of those often untold stories. So to be able to start to get into it, we decided to choose a small story and use it as an example of the many larger stories that are in our community. And in this particular case, it's based around the community of the North Peel Community Church, which is up in Caledon. And I'm just going to scroll down a little bit. You can see the church here. It was built in the 1800s as a church, and then it was closed. It was originally an Anglican church, and that congregation has since moved on to Orangeville, St. Mark's, if anybody's interested. And then I think at one point it was a store. There was a couple other things going on in the building. But the lovely Dr. Ron and Mrs. Claudette Kelly purchased the church for their community, for their congregation, and had to do all kinds of renovations. I'll show you some pictures. There is some beautiful original stained glass windows that are still in the church, but the rest of it was in pretty rough shape. At one point, Mrs. Kelly said they wanted, there were holes in the roof, and one of her stories was they wanted to be closer to God, but not that close. So there was all kinds of work to be done, but the community really rallied around them. The church community, their families, the farmers in the properties around them helped out, and Mr. Kelly himself actually went to Sheridan College to learn building trades so that he could do a lot of the work. So these are some of the stories that we tell on this site. You can learn a little bit more about Pastor and Mrs. Kelly. That's in the early days of the church, and then this was last year just for our exhibit. We had some lovely photos taken for them. And there's also a few pictures of work on the church as well. And again, the community that rallied around, they created a cookbook as a fundraiser. And there's one of the great recipes from that is available on the website as well. The ackee and saltfish, which is sort of Jamaica's national dish, is on there. So the idea with this exhibit was to be able to tell the story of the community in general, and then dive into some of the personal stories as well. And one of my favorites is Kevin Jr., this handsome fellow here, and his dictionary. And this is your classic Webster's dictionary that's got to be about 6 inches thick. And that was his carry-on luggage when his family immigrated from Jamaica to Canada. He was about 8 years old, and he carried this dictionary with him the entire journey. It belonged to his grandmother. And he went on to become the first Black Sergeant Major for the Toronto Scottish Regiment. And that's him in uniform down here. And today he's actually serving overseas in Jordan. And with the beauty of the internet, we were able to touch base with him last week. He's doing very well and is still connected to the church and the community through the power of the internet. Again, he joins in on the church services that are now all online. Even though he's halfway around the world or more, he's able to join in as well. So these are the kind of stories that we really wanted to tell. Personal journeys, personal story. Oh, I'm trying to go back. It's not, let me go back. There we are. It's not the PAMA staff telling the story. It's really, we're providing the place for the community to tell their story. Nicole is a youth pastor, and she does a lot of programming. Not only does the church obviously have their sort of internal community, but they work with the food banks, they do programs in schools, they do lots of seniors and outreach community programming and that kind of thing. So it really is started with a small seed and has since grown into this greater community that then spreads, the ripples spread even farther as they reach out. So we wanted to create this exhibit as an example, as a way to provide a place for those stories to be told. I'm trying to think of other details. There is sort of an order if you go onto our website, and again, when we get, I'm not going to say if, when we get back into PAMA and we're able to see this exhibit again, there is a bit of an order to it. We like to learn about the church first and then the individuals, but the nice thing about the website is that you can click around and look on whatever story that you would like to read. So there's more information and more pictures in each section. I don't know if anybody has any questions or anything. I'm not sure what else I can share with that. It was a wonderful opportunity for me to meet a community that obviously I'm not a part of, and to be able to learn a story that I had no idea was in Caledon, especially. And in Peel, the church is really in the middle of nowhere. It's a crossroads in what I think I've forgotten the name of the community, Springfield. It's just a crossroads, Airport Road and King Street. And the church is sort of all by itself, but it really draws people from all over the community to come every Sunday. And one of my favorite stories from this is we asked the ladies of the church about their hats. It's a very traditional thing, especially in Black churches, but in a lot of churches, but especially in Black churches, to dress up, of course, for Sunday and to wear hats. So in the exhibition, we do have a collection of some of their finest hats, and even down to the, say, third and fourth generation of the congregation now and their favorite hats. So it's a serious exhibit. We tell an important story, but we also like to have a little fun with it as well, with things like that. And we will be expanding the story now that we've got it up. And like Megan said, Black History Month doesn't end at the end of February. It extends through every day. So this exhibit will stay up, and we hopefully are going to add to it. We'll talk to a few more people from the church, and as we do more they do more programming, we can add some of that information as well. So they're very active in their community, and we like to help them promote that. Any questions or anything anybody would like to know or that I can share?
I have a question. You
Sure.
mentioned your favorite story, but are there any stories that you found surprising?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, some of this, if you sort of read between the lines on some of them, I shouldn't say it's surprising. It's unfortunate that they weren't surprising. There's a few quotes about, I'm trying to find who it was. I think it was, they've obviously felt either blatant racism or microaggressions in their community, or growing up in the Peel community. And so some of the quotes are things like, be strong and be an example, and strive towards excellence, know your self-worth, and that sort of thing, which speaks, if you sort of read between the lines, you can hear those stories. So that was unfortunate, but it's a very true part of any community like this. I like this. You're here for a purpose and you can make a difference, right? So they're very inspiring stories. Even though they've gone through some trouble, they've come out the other side, and they're continuing to fight and to work together, and say get out into the community as well. I don't know if anybody has anything else to to ask or add?
If there are any questions, you guys can put them in the chat there. And Maureen, I was wondering if when I know it's sometimes tricky to do this when you're sharing your screen, but when you're finished sharing your screen and I go into my book talk, could you put the link to this in the chat
Absolutely.
box?
Yep, I can do that as
Wonderful.
well. We have a program, it's actually tonight, I realize, at 7 o'clock. I don't know now. Can you see
Yeah.
that? I've switched
Yep.
to, okay.
I can. Yep.
So if you go to our website, which I will post, but it's pama.peelregion.ca, we have a really interesting program tonight. You can still register for it. It's free, but we just like to register so that we know everybody's coming, called the Black Atlantic, Caribbean Connections, the Black Atlantic. And it includes staff from the Black Loyalist Heritage Center in Nova Scotia. And it's a really interesting discussion about the connection between Canada and Jamaica, and especially around the salt fish trade. It's interesting, salt fish is caught here in Canada and it's shipped to Jamaica, and then a lot of times it is shipped back for Jamaican people to eat here in Canada. And if anyone from Canada is traveling to Jamaica, they will often take some of the salt fish with them. So it's just it's a small thing, but it's an interesting tie between the two of them. And so it should be a very interesting discussion tonight about that and the New Brunswick and Nova Scotia communities. So yes, I will
You
put that in the chat.
Great, thanks. There was also an exhibit that PAMA had. I believe it's finished now, When Nights Stirred at Sea. Uh, yeah, we
Yep.
have a Connections Art and Book Club. PAMA and Brampton Library runs in partnership, and in our November meeting, we saw that virtual
I
presentation, I
believe
guess.
it's still, is it still
But that
online?
one was really neat too.
Right. Yeah. So
Yeah.
because that was an artist based, sorry,
Mhm.
I've just gone to our site. We have several online exhibits that you're welcome to have a look at. Yeah, and some of them, unfortunately, we do just because it's artwork that has copyright and artist fees and that sort of thing. We do have to limit the run, like any exhibition. It eventually has to close. But our
Yeah.
voices and several of our other online exhibits will be up now until we take them down. So I know from my point of view with our voices, our journeys, we're going to keep it up and hopefully add to the stories and keep it growing as we go along.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Maureen. That was really neat, and I hope you all can join PAMA tonight at 7, you said?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, so Maureen will put that in the chat, and
Yep.
afterwards I'll put it in the comments on Facebook Live
Okay.
once this wraps up. All right. So if you want to just stop sharing your screen, I can go ahead and share mine again.
Stop sharing. Tag, you're it.
Perfect. And I hope everybody's okay with this, but I am going to keep my camera off because I'm live streaming to Facebook and I'm sharing my screen, and sometimes it just makes everything a little bit choppy. So I hope that's all right. Can you all see the screen that's showing They Call Me George?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about 4 complimentary books today, which I'm really excited to talk about. The first one here is They Call Me George, The Untold Stories of Black Train Porters by Cecil Foster. So before I get into this book, I'd like to tell you a bit about Cecil Foster. The following is taken from his website, cecilfoster.ca. Cecil Foster is often described as a Renaissance man because of his many intellectual interests. He is an author, an academic, a public intellectual. He is intrigued by living in the Americas, that historically idealistic place of second chances for so many individuals and traditional groups of outcasts, the rejected and marginalized, a region teeming with the hybridity and improvisation of peoples and cultures. Foster was born in Barbados, which still provides much material for his writing across genres. He moved to Toronto, Canada, where his writing blossomed and where he eventually became a full-time scholar and academic. So this book is about something that can seem so inconsequential at first glance. That is that it's about train porters in the 20th century. But More specifically and more significantly, it's about Black train porters during a very pivotal moment in Canadian history. Almost all train porters were Black throughout most of the 20th century. It was one of the few jobs that Black people and significantly Black immigrants could get at the time. So Canada touted itself as a great nation full of opportunity, but that opportunity really was limited to white immigrants. And those in power, all white settlers themselves, of course, only valued opportunity for white people. It's important to note that Canadian leaders felt that Black Canadians were inferior. Wilfrid Laurier, for example, was openly racist. And I'd like to take a pause here and deviate slightly from the main subject of this book to speak about the significance of this, because it provides an important foundation, I think, when looking back on racism in Canadian history. I'll quote Foster directly. When looking back on the words and actions of historical figures like Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier, whose policies aimed to make Canada into a country for white people only, it is tempting to excuse them as having less enlightened ideas and of being representatives of their time. But what this argument often forgets is that even in those times, alternative views and actions were offered, and the people in power ignored them. Those things and ideas now classified as good weren't discovered in this present moment, or just because we arrived at the most recent date on some calendar. These powerful people of the past deliberately chose specific views and actions and rationalized their decisions afterwards. They used their power to act in their own self-interest, ignoring all other arguments and entreaties. They made choices and backed them up, not with arguments for the good, but ultimately to reinforce their own political power and social status, regardless of logic and morality. What's good today was good in days gone by. White supremacy was just as evil at the beginning of the 20th century, and many people over the years fought at great risk. Evil is always evil, which is something that those of us living today will need to bear in mind when future generations hold us in judgment. So it's within this context then that we learn how Canada purposely reduced the Black population in Canada over the course of the first half of the 20th century so as to avoid the quote racial trap that the United States created with its dependence on Black labor. As Foster explains, by reducing immigration to mainly white immigrants, Canadian leaders thought of themselves as the protagonists in the story of British white supremacy. But when Canada did let Black immigrants through their doors a century ago, one of the few jobs permitted was to be train porter. But as you can imagine, it wasn't easy living and working in a country that saw you as a problem waiting to happen. And all of this led to the spring of 1954, when a group of Black train porters and activists assembled at Union Station in Toronto to embark on a 6-hour trip to Ottawa with the hopes of meeting the next morning with Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent. Their motto was simple: dedicated to the making of a better Canadian citizen. It's from this point that Foster weaves together the stories of these protesters together to show us how much we owe to them. And as he says from the get-go, without railways that brought in Black porters to Canada, the situation would have been even starker for Black people in Canada. The next book that I would like to talk about is a work of fiction. This is Brother by David Cheriandy. So first, again, a note on the author. This is from Ryerson University's website. David Cheriandy was raised in Toronto by his Black and South Asian immigrant parents from Trinidad. He earned both a BA and MA from Carleton University and a PhD in English from York University. His PhD dissertation is entitled Land to Light On: Black Canadian Literature and the Language of Belonging. And his first 2 novels are set in Scarborough, Ontario, prior to the city's amalgamation with other municipalities to form the megacity Toronto. So Brother follows the story of 2 brothers, Michael and Francis, who one can assume, based on the biography that I just read, Cheriandy can relate to, at least in part, because they are the sons of Trinidadian parents. And we read their story from Scarborough in the summer of 1991. Scarborough itself is a significant character in this story. First of all, 1991 was the deadliest year in Scarborough's history. It is during this tumultuous summer that we are introduced to Michael and Frances. Their single mother works double, sometimes triple shifts to provide for them, so that they may catch the whims of the Canadian dream that she and their father once envisioned for them, a dream which now feels a little bit harder to grasp. With teachers who set them aside in generalized classrooms, shopkeepers who keep an extra set of eyes on them, police who cuff them because of the proximity to a suspected crime coupled with the color of their skin. One can't blame Michael and Frances for struggling to form an identity that is attached to the country that doesn't seem to set a place for them at the dinner table. Yet, they do have their dreams and their ambitions like any young men do. But like the dreams of many of Scarborough's youth that summer, their visions of the future turn bleak once they find themselves in the center of a tragic shooting. This story is told at a tight pace, but the details of the characters and settings don't lack. You can taste their mother's food and feel the summer evening breeze as you sink into the hearts of these boys. This story, while a work of fiction, brings to life a common story of second-generation Black Canadian kids. The next book I'd like to talk about, and if you're engaged in literature over the last year, especially as the Black Lives Matter movement really took off this summer, you likely have read this one, but I just have to speak about it. It's The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance by Desmond Cole. The Skin We're In was written in response to Cole's 2015 Toronto Live Award-winning cover story, The Skin I'm In, that chronicled his personal experiences of being racially profiled by Toronto police through the practice of carding. Over the years, Cole had been stopped and carded by police more than 50 times while innocently walking down the street. It was a story familiar to many Black Canadians, and yet unfamiliar to Canadians who had the privilege to turn their heads the other way. This story was the 7th most read article of the decade in Toronto Life is a testament to how much it resonated with many Canadians and shook many others. Cole won 3 awards at the National Magazine Award that same year for this piece. The success of this article provided a platform for Cole to become a prominent activist in Canada, which led to the release of this book last year. While The Skin I'm In outlined Cole's own experience with racial profiling in Canada, this book, The Skin We're In, chronicles the stories of other Black Canadians and their own struggle against racism in Canada during the year 2017. In the opening chapter, January, Cole provides his eloquent thesis for this book. He says, in 2016, I kept track of the violence done to Black people in my city, Toronto, and my country, Canada, as if it was being done to me, because it was, because it is, because that's what Black people are facing in Canada and around the world, and I'd never been made more aware of it. I already know what police choose over and over and over again to intimidate and attack and kill Black people in my city, in Canada. It has nothing to do with any single incident, any presumed provocation or threat or misunderstanding. The police are just doing their job. A central responsibility of policing has always been to discipline Black people on behalf of the ruling class. And with that, Cole chronicles 12 months of violence against Black people in Canada, 1 month at a time. Cole is unapologetic in his outcry against each of these injustices, expertly drawing connections between them and the deeper cultural and historical roots that allowed them to harvest. It is by bringing these stories together that readers begin to see that they do not exist in a vacuum. And with this brief overview of a book that goes so deep and is so profound and so eloquent, I have to say that I am really not doing it justice. So I really must recommend that you go ahead and read Cole's words for yourself if you haven't done so yet. All right, so perhaps I shouldn't play favorites with these books, and truly all 4 of these books that I'm talking about today are great. But if I had to just pick one, this one, I have to say, this one's my favorite. Perhaps it's a personal preference, so of course you could have a totally different opinion from me because I happen to really love short stories and I also really love nonfiction. And this is creative nonfiction at its finest. Black Writers Matter is an anthology of African Canadian writing. Some of the writers in this anthology are established authors, while others are novices, and yet each stands on its own as a truly compelling piece. With each story, I felt myself sinking into the soul of each writer. The tone, style, and subject matter of each story is diverse. For example, one story is written as a checklist in an attempt for the author to understand not only the origins of her eating disorder, but also to reconcile with the internal struggle that, as a Black woman, the world does not understand how she can have this particular struggle. Another story follows a young man's dream to ride his bike across Canada after being systemically excluded from outdoor spaces throughout his formative years, a seemingly untouchable goal for a Black person. As he pushes his body to the extremes through vast and diverse landscapes from coast to coast, he questions his motives. This becomes a retelling not of triumph, as you might think, but rather a retelling of the revelation he's come to in the retelling of his story. That is, why does he need to prove himself and his audience that he belongs here? In her introduction, Whitney French writes, "A part of me wanted this anthology to have the energy of a big dinner where everyone is loosely related. Some folks know each other, some do not. We've all come from different places and all have made long journeys to get here, sitting inside someone else's experience through the written world." The big family dinner thing, I know now, is less about the illusion of unity and more about the immediate and undeniable truths of our stories. Our plainness and extraordinariness, our mundane disasters and collective devastations. Our stories are our survival, and to slap lofty ideas of a coherence and conclusiveness would be false, a distracting from a distancing from nonfiction. So I invite readers to shift, rattle, augment their understanding of creative nonfiction, which often appears in the form of an essay that proves a point, to a blending of multiple genres. This blending is organically Canadian, a true multiverse of cultures that doesn't ignore systemic oppressions, unlike the branded benevolent multiculturalism we've been fed for far too long. So I think that French here summarizes beautifully what I love so much about this anthology. It's a diverse collection of perspectives drawn together by a common thread, and each of the writers chronicles a unique life, and each of those lives have been impacted by systemic oppression, while those who are not Black, and particularly those who are white settlers, enjoy the comfortable illusion of a multicultural utopia. So obviously there are so many more books that I can recommend, and my colleagues have put together 2 great blog posts, which are listed at the top of this page with many, many more recommendations, such as those you see here. I want to bring today's program to a conclusion that actually reflects on my own personal experience reading these books. I think it's worth noting that I'm reading these books and also that I'm sitting on this platform to talk about them right now, not only from outside these writers' perspectives, but even more significantly, from a perspective that has been shaped by my own experience as a white settler. When you live within the skin of the privileged, as I have my whole life, it can be all too easy to dismiss racism that is not overt. And while I don't want to diminish the fact that overt racism does exist in Canada, historically, as Foster outlines, and currently, as Cole chronicles, Black Canadians are often devalued and not included in Canadian history and in Canadian identity in ways that are so subtle that it can be easy to ignore. And it can truthfully be tempting to ignore if the alternative, that is, recognizing systemic racism and your role in perpetuating it, is uncomfortable. And so, as a white settler who has the privilege to ignore the nuance of white supremacy if I wanted to, I find it so important to not ignore it. And one way to do this is by making a conscious effort when I'm reading these books or listening to these stories to read and to listen to them without dismissing them, and to simply just let their words sink in. And it's only then that Black voices in Canada can not only be spoken, but they can be heard. So all that said, I really don't think that as a white person, I should be the one to have the last word here. So I'm going to finish with a quote by Whitney French, which she wrote in her introduction of Black Voices Matter. And I just want to make sure that, okay, I just wanted to make sure there's nothing in the chat there. So this quote is important to me to end on, because it's simply not my place to have the final voice in this. So instead, I'll ask you to move forward and to continue reading and listening, and to let these voices speak to you. French says, "I'm not interested in asking people to see our humanity. I'm simply here to celebrate it. Read on and celebrate alongside me."